Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Kritika, and I work as a researcher at the Center for Wildlife Studies. CWS is a 37-year-old nonprofit organization specializing in wildlife research, conservation, policy, and education. Until 2020, we used to host public talks on the latest topics in wildlife science and conservation in our Bangalore office. Due to the pandemic, we have instead been conducting a series of webinars covering a wide range of interesting topics such as public health and zoonotic diseases, tigers, elephants, snake bites, and bioacoustics. Today's discussion is on understanding the impact of infrastructure development on wildlife conservation. We live in an ever-changing world where infrastructure provides connectivity and access to resources. CWS has a huge history of understanding how development goals can impact the environment and has provided scientific, data-driven solutions to balance these goals with that of conserving our biodiversity. Today, we have with us Srinivas Vaidyanathan and Suman Jumani to provide more insights on the topic. Srinivas Vaidyanathan is the Senior Fellow and Trustee of the Foundation for Ecological Research, Advocacy and Learning, India. He graduated in ecology from Pondicherry University and his research focuses on landscape ecology, space-time analysis, and connectivity conservation. He has a particular interest in understanding the changes in landscape-level structure and processes that affect the distribution and abundance of large mammal populations. He has authored and co-authored over 50 scientific articles and reports and 4 books. Suman Jumani is a PhD candidate at the Soil and Water Sciences Department at the University of Florida. Her research interests lie in applied freshwater ecology and conservation science. Her previous work has focused on understanding the socio-ecological consequences of small hydropower development, and she has engaged with policymakers, lawyers, and other stakeholders to better integrate science into conservation-based decision-making. Her ongoing research aims to assess the socio-ecological consequences of river infrastructure projects in the data-deficit Western Ghats landscape and develop tools to aid in basin-wide conservation and development planning. Thank you for joining us, Suman and Srinivas. So to get started off, could you tell us a little about how you got interested in the topic? Srinivas, can we start with you?
Thanks, Kritika. Thanks for organizing this. I know these are tough times, and I would like to thank everyone who has taken off time to come here to listen to us. And personally, I was trained as an ecologist, and like any other ecologist or researcher, we are always interested in understanding how individuals or species or population responds to changes in their habitat. That's part of how we are trained. But on a personal front, we initiated a whole lot of series of research projects in the southern Western Ghats in the early 2000, and that gave me first-hand experience not only to gather data but also to make some observations and to understand how these habitat modifications, in this case largely forested habitats, are affecting distribution of species, their ranging behavior, and also for certain species how it is limiting their dispersal. So that's where I started investing resources and time in understanding issues around connectivity and dispersal. So from then on, it was a series of collaborative research projects both in South India and Central India that got me going, and we still continue to focus on connectivity conservation as one of our areas of interest.
That is great to hear. Thank you for joining us. Suman?
Hi, Kritika. Thank you, and to CWS for having me here. This is like a great topic to talk about. So, again, for me, like the whole thing started off with this. I wanted to be a vet growing up, and then in college, I really got working with these wildlife groups like Arosha and Agumbe, participating in different field experiences, and that's how I found myself in the field of wildlife and ecology. And when you're studying a particular system, there are always threats to the system, things that are influencing the way, the ecology and conservation of it. And often these negative impacts come from ill-planned developmental projects and infrastructure projects. So invariably, you do need to look there and consider those. And for me, during my master's, I was studying elephant ranging behavior in Mudumalai. And around 2012, that's when there was the report by the Karnataka Elephant Task Force talking about small dams posing as a barrier to elephant movement in these corridors. And that was the first instance where I pivoted towards looking at small dams and river systems. And ever since, I've been on this trajectory.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear, and that provides a nice segue into this topic that we're trying to discuss today. So could you share some of the major types of developmental projects that are known to impact precious habitats and wildlife?
So again, I would say it depends. There are lots of different types of infrastructure projects, and depending on where you are, different kinds of projects would have different influences. So for example, the iron ore belts, the mining belts, we would have mining and other ancillary projects as the main drivers. Closer home to Bangalore and Bannerghatta, quarrying is like the biggest threat. But I think most ubiquitously, like around India, linear infrastructure projects are some of the biggest threats. And these include roads and transmission lines, water diversion structures, canals, and yeah.
I see. Srinivas, so roads and transmission lines are bringing much required resources everywhere in India. Could you tell us a little more about how this is impacting the environment?
Just to add to what Suman said earlier, so broadly you can classify all these development projects into linear and non-linear. So non-linear would include mines, dams, solar farm, power plants, anything else. So linear is anything that goes straight, and we continue to keep a tab on projects that need forest clearance, and I think, if I'm right, until the end of April, starting from 2014 onwards, 89% of the projects which came for clearances were linear infrastructure projects. And there was not much attention to linear projects because the area that is required to be diverted from a forest is very small compared to a dam or a mine. So probably it went under the carpet for under the radar for several years. And they have their own impacts. First, irrespective of the kind of project, there's a loss of natural habitat. And once there is a loss, you are fragmenting the habitat. I use natural habitat because grasslands and other systems tend to get neglected, which is why I'm using the term natural habitats rather than forests. And negative impacts of fragmentation are something that has been studied, well studied, India and abroad. So 80s and 90s, bulk of our research just focused on impacts of fragmentation, and results have shown that biodiversity declines. Then there's an increase in pests and invasives. There's also a reduction in water quality. And as these natural habitats get more isolated, then you start having other issues where processes get broken down. For example, seed dispersal might be a limiting factor, so you might not have movement of plants. The same holds good for animals, where their ranging and dispersal abilities are reduced. And once these effects kick in, you will start seeing issues with gene flow and population viability. There could be a long-term decline in populations. And along with something that is stark, where you see certain parts of the habitat just being stripped or lost, what you also will see is mortality along these linear infrastructure projects, like road kills or kills on railway lines. They attract a lot of public attention, and so those are some of the impacts that you will see. So the immediate would be loss of habitat and maybe mortality. Some other impacts might take a while for it to kick in, and will take longer studies to understand their impacts.
So based on your extensive, experience in this line, have you come across like experiences where you have seen populations either decimate to a large extent because of such, linear infrastructures?
I wouldn't. At least in India, we don't have such effect where populations have been wiped out. But what is emerging from the research that's going on in India is certain populations have become isolated. So it could be due to a whole lot of reasons, not just linear infrastructure. It also includes how the surrounding matrix has changed, become hostile for animals to move across. So it's not necessarily we don't have complete wipeouts. And all we have evidence so far, at least for large mammals, is they have become isolated and they have become highly inbred. So the population is breeding within itself. So right now it might look like numbers are being maintained or they are continuing to grow, but they're highly inbred. A single disease could just wipe these populations out. And that's what we have, at least for large mammals. I'm quite sure Suman will have some examples from a river system, because that behaves completely differently. It's a linear system, so any kind of disruption, I think the impacts and effects are a lot more drastic and visible as compared to a terrestrial system. Suman, you want to add something about rivers?
Yeah, absolutely, Srini. I was waiting for Kritika, but okay. So so like Srini said, rivers are these connected linear networks that have water-mediated connectivity. So as long as you have flows, the connectivity exists. And often when we have these barriers built across the river, which could be dams or barrages or weirs, it's cutting off connectivity. And unlike terrestrial systems, if you have a road and there might be, other pathways of connectivity between habitat patches, in rivers, once you do build a barrier, you're often cutting off connectivity completely because there are no alternative pathways that may exist. So at least in our studies in the Western Ghats, what we see is that even small hydropower projects do bring about complete community shifts. So tributaries that are dammed show drastically reduced abundances of sensitive species like Tor Kudri, which are migratory species. And then they show increased abundances of generalist species. So in that sense, you could say there's some level of decimation. And there are also these dewatered river stretches that tend to get created with particular kinds of dams. And there we often find like desiccated frog eggs. We see fish trapped in small puddles of water, which become easy prey to predatory birds or even poachers. We found eels, which are diadromous. So they live in fresh water and they migrate all the way down to the ocean to go reproduce. And we ourselves have come across at least 3 different eels trapped in these dewatered stretches because they are not able to pass the barrier and go down. And then local people would come there to catch these fish because they're really hard to catch otherwise. So there are lots of issues of, these kind of altered habitats creating traps for these animals and also directly affecting their movement, causing direct mortality. So let's tackle. Have we lost Kritika?
Are you okay? Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for jumping in. So we spoke a little about the impact of developmental projects on wildlife and their habitats. Do you also see these effects kind of spilling over to affecting people, contrary to what is the perceived benefits of such developmental projects?
Srini, you want to go for that?
Yeah, so all these projects are designed to either improve movement of goods, people, or provide some kind of economic benefits to the society. and that is why they are being implemented. And when they are poorly planned and poorly implemented, there are several concerns that arise. If you just look at, if you took roads for example, there is issues of safety, human safety also, which is often neglected. Like just like how animals can get killed or injured in road accidents, people also and vehicles tend to get injured. So this aspect is completely neglected. So nobody even talks about these kind of hazards that people can experience. And at least in the West, they have tried using this argument, especially for roads in wilderness zones, where they've pitched it as human safety and driver safety issues that can arise because of linear projects. And unfortunately, that hasn't been so in the Indian context. I'm hoping it'll somebody will study these kind of impacts and pass it on to our policy makers. And other than direct effects, when people stay in forested habitats, when these infrastructure projects come, there is a shift in the kind of pathogens and pests that they're exposed to. So disease, emerging diseases is a concern. And again, this is very poorly documented. We have some experimental studies done in Western Ghats which show these kind of shifts, but these are not large projects where things have been documented exhaustively. But yes, there are these health issues and emerging diseases which also need attention. And it's not just being in forested habitats. So when you're outside, even in agricultural areas, there are impacts that people go through when these projects are implemented. So there is an issue of land being acquired for these projects. So we really don't know the kind of socioeconomic impacts of these kind of large land transfers. And especially in a country where land holdings are small, if only a small portion of somebody's land is acquired, then there are issues of his livelihood, the ability to continue farming. So there are these whole lot of associated socioeconomic impacts that arise from these projects. So, and a classic example of a project which was opposed widely was the expansion of the so-called Chennai-Salem road. So the road technically required a very small chunk of forest to be diverted. So it was a reserve forest and it was on the edge of the forest where the project proponent had asked for it to be diverted from forest to non-forest. But bulk of the road just went through agricultural fields and water bodies. So these are irrigation tanks which were built hundreds of years ago. And the argument that people had was, yes, bringing in such large infrastructure projects affects their lives and livelihoods. I'm sure there are people who study these kind of socioeconomic impacts, how people have to dispose their land, move to larger towns, cities, and what happens to them. So there is that angle which is often neglected from the narrative. So it's not just forested habitat. If you look at the project totally, the impacts are probably larger than what we think.
I see. So you spoke a little about roadkills and road safety. And, often we see these signs when we pass through, roads that pass through like parks, wildlife parks and wildlife reserves, for example, that say that, you have like speed limits and, warning signs that say that, there's going to be wildlife crossing. And often there's also restrictions on, what times the road usage can happen. Has that contributed at all to improving the road safety of either travelers or reducing the deaths that occur, in wildlife deaths that occur?
Um, So when you look at mitigation structures, these signboards, speed restrictions, signboards and speed restrictions. So these are called soft measures. They're meant to change the driver's mentality or behavior. So basically, it makes the driver. It's supposed to make the driver more aware and more cautious and things like that. So they're less effective when it comes to wildlife road kills as compared to having some hard mitigation measures. When I say hard mitigation measure, it could be night closure. So you might say we are going to close the road during night, or we are going to close the road permanently, or you could think of having some underpass for wildlife, overpass for wildlife. They tend to perform better than the soft measures. So there's a whole lot of literature on these soft measures. They are not as effective. Yes, they do work, but I would say if an investment is being made, you invest in proper mitigation structure, invest little in driver modifying drivers' behavior. It is required not only for making sure there are no animals dying. It's also you can bump into other vehicles. So just to prevent accidents, yeah, educating drivers is required, but it's not as effective as taking hard steps.
Right, and we'll explore that topic a little later. But Suman, back to the developmental projects that happen on riverine systems. Do you see any sort of spillover of the impacts on affect and that go and affect people as well? And I know you've done a little bit of socio-ecological research on this, so could you please tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Kritika. So, in terms of spillover to social impacts, at least in the riverine system, we see so many examples. So, like looking at up north in the mountains, when you have these large dams being built, there's a lot of blasting work that happens. And we know of cases where the blasting and the construction of a single dam led to the drying up of about 21 hill springs that was the source of water for numerous villages around the place. So local communities, they were directly impacted by loss of their water supply, people's houses developed cracks, their orchards started, the edge of their orchards lost stability, and they would lose like really expensive chunks of land through to landslides and things like that. For the south also we see, so in India has this track record, like we rank third in the world in a number of large dams, and it's estimated that we've displaced about 35 to 40 million people just to construct these projects. And this is not a fixed number. No one knows for sure what the exact number is. This is an estimate. And again, a lot of these people are displaced multiple times. So the same set of people are displaced, moved somewhere to build a dam. And then again, the dam is built up, and the same set of people asked to move again. And not surprisingly, it's marginalized communities, tribal communities, the Dalits, who are disproportionately affected by these impacts. In terms of small dams in the Western Ghats, that's a whole other story. We see that these dams come up on the pretext of being green infrastructure projects, and they guarantee social benefit. So they explicitly claim in their project design documents that they are going to provide direct economic benefits to communities through employment, electricity generation, and then other social measures, like they would claim they will build a school or a temple or a road for local communities. And when we went on ground to check like how much of these assured benefits have been realized to the community, we found that the whole thing was a farce. So the employment generated is largely given to out-of-state people, and the local communities are given very little employment. When they do receive employment, it's largely temporary in nature. So they get these temporary jobs that are paying just at about the minimal wage. And there are lots of unanticipated negative benefits that they don't account for. So lots of people lost access to river reaches that they would regularly use to fish or to wash. Lots of these dams can literally come up without any community consultation. So just one day, suddenly the dam owners come, block the river, they can start constructing transmission lines. And when local communities in our study site try to protest the same, because They believe that these transmission lines would reduce the value of their land holdings. A bunch of them were arrested. At least 15 people we know were thrown into jail for this. And then the most surprising thing of all was the construction of 4 small dams in the Yetanhole headwater catchment led to an increase in human-elephant conflict for the entire region. So when local communities told us this, we were really surprised. Like, how can dam construction directly cause conflict? But we really looked into it because so many people told us this same trend. And so we went to the forest department and looked at claims data being filed. We dug into project design documents to find out when were these projects actually being constructed on ground. And all the data lined up. So when these dams were being constructed, just immediately afterwards, the number of claims filed by local people with the department for conflict rose by 200 to 800%.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're there and you're seeing the way construction happens, it's not surprising to know why, because they are doing a lot of blasting work, which causes large sounds and reverberations. Entire hills are being razed to the ground, movement of heavy machinery. And this is an elephant corridor. So when there are all these disturbances that are coming in the way of natural elephant movement, they are getting diverted towards humans and coming into conflict there. So there are a lot of spillover effects on local communities.
I see. You brought up a really interesting point about how it is usually the same communities that get displaced over and over again. Could you explain a little about why that could be the case?
I would just say that I think the people are not given the respect they deserve in these cases. These are often people with very little resources at their disposal. And even in the case of the Narmada Dam, right? Like the people who were rehabilitated in such bad conditions. And often when people are being moved, there's no long-term foresight about, okay, what's the best kind of land they can move to? What are the livelihood alternatives they can be adapted to?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just a matter of really bad planning and lack of respect for these communities.
I see. Is there also, in your observation, a case where, tributaries of rivers keep getting these infrastructure projects, tributaries as well, and not just on the main channel? Or is that something that is happening in these tropical countries? And is that a trend that we're beginning to see just because these are like so-called green infrastructure projects?
You're absolutely right. So I think a few decades ago, a large, like the dam boom that was happening was these large dams.
Mm-hmm.
And today people are recognizing the ecological and the social costs associated with these large projects. So now the boom that we are seeing is this proliferation of smaller dams, which tend to come up on, like you said, these smaller tributaries which have been previously undammed. So we're seeing a lot of these headwater tributaries being dammed with so-called green infrastructure projects, which in reality are often not green, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's affecting a whole different range of habitats and communities very differently, which need to be studied.
Yeah. So moving on from the problem and trying to get into the solution, how can we begin to use science to address these issues with like IDPs? Srini sir, if you want to start on that.
No, to come up with a solution, you need to study the problem. So there's no, it's like, I would say that is the basic requirement. So without research or any kind of monitoring documentation, there is no way you can come up with a solution. And you can come up with a guideline. So a guideline is something which will say, okay, if you are building a road, you put a mitigation structure, include a mitigation structure in your plan. But the larger question is where and what is the size and how do you do it? What is the design of this mitigation structure? All that comes from hard field data which should be collected. And
Mm-hmm.
there is no quick fix for it. So field work and research becomes a part and parcel of developing these plans. So right now, this is being done by civil society or research organizations or individuals who are interested, rather than the development proponent. So if a road is being constructed by the state government or state highway department or national highway department, they should have a wing of qualified people who are able to collect this information and drive these plans. So that doesn't seem to be happening. And like I said, so all this research is required. So even to come up with a policy to address these issues. So if you want to make some guidelines, give some suggestions, if you want to come up with larger framework, so all that is possible only when you have results from multiple studies. So if you end up studying 100 roads, then you can probably come up with a way of how do you monitor effectiveness of these mitigation structures. So right now we don't have that kind of science going on. Yeah, at least in the Indian context, I would say we're in the very early stage of road ecology and things like that. Yes, countries like Canada and US started 20, 20, 35 years ago to start these kind of studies. So they have a long database to understand, make recommendations. But even globally, we need a whole lot of study to understand effectiveness. So we don't have. So these strategies will change. You need to adapt. So there is no single prescription for a problem, and it is highly site specific. So what will work in one context need not work in the other. So research becomes and science becomes a key part of it, and doing it well is the crux of it.
Right. So you have worked on the SNAP project, which is trying to address some of these issues with, like, I think, spatial data sets and stuff. Could you speak a little more about that and how that is bridge this gap in the research?
SNAP was a very interesting project for me because the whole challenge that we faced was how we take science out to the public. So it was less of trying to get papers out and academic work, but I think what was more interesting to me was how do you take the results from these papers out to people who are likely to use it. So that is what SNAP was largely about, and that's what gained interest. And to start with, SNAP, we looked at how connectivity is affected by infrastructure projects, and when we started with a very data-rich environment. We took tigers as an example, where we had tons of data. I would say data-rich because we had genetic information. We could do fancy modeling to show how roads are affecting tigers, their dispersal, and things like that. But later on, we kind of felt lot of species don't have that luxury in India. So data is deficient. You don't even have information on their distribution, forget genetic information and things like that. So the whole project turned to developing tools where you could model their dispersal just based on existing natural history or papers that are out there already, where you have some information on home ranges, population sizes, dispersal distances. So very basic pieces of information which should be out there, or you could collect it if you have a bunch of experts. So using something called agent-based modeling, we simulated how animals would move in space and where they're likely to be constrained or channeled, or they don't move at all. So that was very interesting and also intensive. So it is computationally very intensive, but we were able to show for the first time that even if you don't have data, you could come up with some meaningful results. And we did that for 5 species in the Western Ghats and 5 species in the Central Indian landscape. And there was also an interest that because species respond differently to these infrastructure projects, there was a interest to see what would it look if you had multiple species, if you considered multiple species while you were analyzing. So a framework of to merge these results was also developed. So in that sense, Snap is unique. It was a fun and learning experience that the entire team enjoyed. And for me, most importantly was, okay, you could come up with these fancy maps and results, but we spent a lot of time talking to people who need this kind of information, be it for advocacy or to pursue with their local representatives or whatever use. So how are they going to make use of that information? That was the more challenging and interesting part of it, because we think everybody knows how to read a map, how to extract information and decipher what is out there in a graph, but unfortunately that is not the truth. So we had to work a whole lot on simplifying that science, put it out on the internet for people to make use of. And yeah, so right now there's a portal which people keep using, and we get tons of requests from people asking for layers, asking for information, clarification. So in that sense, it has been interesting project to be part of.
Thank you for sharing that. And we'll get a little bit into how you can translate this into on-ground impact. But Suman, what are some of the scientific approaches that you have been using to address this development versus environment question that we have?
Yeah, so okay, so like Srini said, this is such a complicated question, right? And it varies from case to case, project to project, landscape to landscape. And one thing is, all of us are looking at it through one lens. So if I'm going on field, I'm looking at it in terms of, okay, how do I restore fish passage? But somebody else may look at it in terms of restoring elephant movement or in maintaining a tree community. And there are all these different aspects to conservation and biodiversity that need to be looked at together, both the species, the ecosystem, and the processes that, are all linked through them. So like Shini said, we are largely limited by data gaps. We have a lot of like basic data, long-term monitoring data that is not really available, that could otherwise have been used to come up with really powerful modeling and optimization tools. But given our data limitations, I still think scientists are able to come up with some, like we follow the precautionary principle. So given that we have limited data, if we choose to err on the side of caution, we could still come up with, say, basin-wide conservation prioritization plans, where so scientists have been saying for a really long time that within a given river basin, we should delineate some tributaries as free-flowing. They should be undammed for posterity because they provide refuge or habitats. Similarly, you need to have free-flowing river stretches, some minimum interdam distances. Environmental flows should be allowed in the river, even when you have a dam. Flows below the dam should mimic natural cycles so that life histories that depend on these pulses of flows continue. So there are ways to mitigate these impacts, and scientists have been talking about best practices based on what we know. And the real pain point, apart from the data limitation, is really getting people to implement these strategies. So even in terms of the Western Ghats, we had the Gadgil report and the Kasturi Rangan report, which spoke about conserving large chunks of the landscape and then having this kind of a zonation approach where we have complete protection, then areas where we can have some protection and some development, and areas where development can take over. But getting political support and getting other stakeholders to go with these things is where I think the challenge lies.
Right. So I know that in the US, quite a few of these damming projects were like reversed when they understood that the environmental flows were not really being maintained, and just to preserve the environment and the ecosystem of the rivers, they did go back and like undam these tributaries. Is there such a history in India or in the tropics where, SHPs are so prevalent?
I hope there will be such a story, at least in our lifetime. So in the US, damming began much before it began in India, right? Like, so a lot of their current dam infrastructure is very, very old. Like the average age of dams in California is something like 71 years old. And a lot of their dams are like more than 150 years old. So they've reached the end of their lifespan. And they're no longer able to provide the function they were built for. So they could have issues of safety associated with them, like the Mullaperiyar Dam in Kerala, which has some cracks developing, and there are safety issues. And also dams that like maybe are completely filled up with sediment, so they're not able to provide the water storage or hydropower generating capacity that they were built for. Those dams are really being identified and broken down here in the US. And it's sort of like a win-win strategy, because the amount of money you invest to repair these dams, to either make it safe socially or to bring back its utility, is so much more than the amount of money you'd spend to just break it down. And when you break it down, not only are you dealing with the safety issue, you're also sort of restoring the river. So they have anadromous fish here, which people love to, they have cultural associations with this fish, and it supports a multi-billion-dollar recreation angling fishing industry. So there are lots of wins, and I am hoping that this comes to India too, because a lot of our infrastructure is also aging. A lot of these small dams, because of lack of maintenance, are getting filled up with sediment, and their efficacy or their output really drops with time. And so that's part of some of the research I'm doing. In fact, for my PhD, looking at basin-wide spatial conservation plans, trying to come up with no-go zones where we identify critical river reaches as being important in that particular network, which should not be dammed under any circumstances, and also being more pragmatic. So it may sound a little controversial, but also maybe giving the government options, saying, okay, these are reaches where perhaps if you want to dam, you should go ahead and consider it. So identifying good and bad dams, good and bad locations, priority mitigation zones. So if you have an amazing river in a forested catchment, and then there's one large dam on the main stem that's really hampering ecological processes across the river, but if we make an investment to build in some mitigation measures in that particular dam, and it would have far-ranging positive benefits, those are the kind of places I think science can really make a positive contribution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think I have one last question before we open the panel up for questions from the audience. So we spoke about these different lenses from which we are trying to address the problem. And I think one of the biggest lenses is that of policy, especially in India. So my question is that, are there policy tools specifically that can help us plan better, and how effective are they? Srinivas sir, if you'd like to start off.
The policy and law is actually in place. It's just that we have not followed it for years. And yes, there might be some scope for refinement and improvement, which I agree, but the law is in place. So the law does not allow you to do whatever you want. So that is the first step. Now you have law, but following the law is a policy and a guideline which is required, which is currently, I would say, in a bad shape, which definitely needs refinement. So over the last decade or so, we have diluted a lot of these procedures and processes that were in place to clear projects, which are seriously getting diluted. So we need to stem that first and look at what are these new loopholes that have come, how are they impacting scrutiny of project proposals, and things like that. That needs to be fixed. So while you're doing that, it's also important there's a whole lot of transparency, public participation, better enforcement and monitoring of these projects. So right now, there is no transparency. So public meetings and hearings are being abandoned for certain kinds of projects. And there is no monitoring. So be it either during the implementation phase or post implementation, there's hardly any monitoring that is being done to hold the user agency responsible. And and without monitoring, you're not going to learn anything. So there is a whole lot of changes that need to be brought in, and I would say it is required. So our earlier concerns were natural habitats were being lost because of diversion. So it could be to agriculture or industrial development and things like that. That stopped somewhere in the 80s. So the emerging threat is all these projects which are likely to come, be it linear, non-linear, whatever. The problems remain the same more or less. And the biggest problem we face is that when these projects are put up for scrutiny, the entire project is not shown as one package bundle. So they're broken down into smaller chunks. So getting clearances become easier. So if you are building a dam, the dam is separate. The access road to the dam is shown separately. The transmission line is shown separately. So you will see some under linear, non-linear. And the proponent will say, yes, you gave me permission to build the road, so I'll build the dam. So the argument goes both ways. So I think there is a real need to look at the project as a whole. And if you just looked at roads, so roads are broken down into 100-kilometer stretches to get clearances. The excuse used is there are jurisdictional issues. I agree. There are different forest officers who need to sign on that project document, but getting everybody's consensus also is easy. And when it goes for clearance, one chunk of the road is given clearance, and therefore the other chunks also automatically should be given clearance. So that is the current practice. And also what it does is it gives the user agency a justification to argue, or a point to where he can argue saying any kind of mitigation is more expensive than the project. So, but if you added up all the total length of the project, the amount of money you would spend for mitigation would be minuscule. So right now it looks inflated because clearances are being asked for in chunks. So the cost of mitigation just goes up. But if you took the entire length, then it is probably a small fraction. So these are some of these issues that need to be addressed. And I'm sure Suman will add to these points on cumulative impacts, which is something that is badly required, and it's probably easier done in a riverine or freshwater system, because like I said earlier, it's a linear thing. So doing cumulative impacts on a linear system is easier than a terrestrial system. We really don't know. We don't have a framework, or we haven't put our minds together to see how we do cumulative impacts for a terrestrial system. And I think projects should be evaluated on not just
on a larger basis.
Yeah, not on a single project, but I think there should be a section where they say, what is the cumulative impact of this project? Okay, there are project specific impacts. People will get displaced. You will destroy some forest, you will break down some hills. So several things can happen, which is very project specific. But what about how does this project affect the entire landscape in relationship with other projects that are already there and those that are going to be proposed? So that is a framework that is badly needed to take wise decisions.
Right. And is that the loophole in the system that is allowing for projects to be broken down into these smaller projects that then get approved faster, or?
No, I think it's just a new way of looking at things. So you have looked at single projects, but if you look at a given landscape, so if you just took some, if you define central Indian landscape, there will be multiple road projects coming up. It could just be that two roads are connecting cities that are close by, and the question is, do you need both those roads? Can't one road serve the purpose? So these are kind of questions that emerge. And what about already existing roads? Is there a need to add a new road, expand it? So and are existing roads not sufficient? So you can take all those decisions only when you look at it from a larger landscape perspective, when you understand the cumulative impacts. So and there is our policy doesn't ask for cumulative impacts. So it just says what is the environmental impact.
Yes. Suman, kind of adding to that, is there scope in the policy to identify what are the good dams and the bad dams and the ones that are outdated? Or what is policy like for riverine systems?
Um, okay, so in terms of the policy that could help us mitigate the negative impacts of these infrastructure projects, for projects that fall under the purview of the EIA notification, so these are projects that need to apply for an environmental clearance, they need to do an EIA report, and also do some public consultations with affected communities. There are some requirements. So all projects that go through that process need to have something called an options assessment, where they need to assess whether the project itself is needed. So there's a no options. I mean, there's a no project option that needs to be assessed. So if there's a road being proposed, it's like, what if we don't build the road? Do we really need this road? And then you're also assessing alternative options. So if there is a proposed alignment, you're also going to explore 3-4 alternative alignments that say perhaps go outside of a particular forest area or a protected area. And you need to do like an in-depth cost-benefit analysis of the project, where you're taking into account all the costs that the project may result in, direct and indirect, as well as the benefits. Currently, the way they are done is a joke. It's a mockery of the system, because these EIA reports are largely plagiarized, false information, misleading information, half-baked information, right? But there are a few examples where these particular sections in an EIA report have resulted in projects being shelved. For example, the Hubli and Kola railway line, the EIA project that was prepared by IISC. There are lots of flaws in the report, agreed, but the report does state that the costs imposed by these projects, the losses of these old growth forests, are going to be irreparable, irreversible impacts that no amount of compensatory afforestation can mitigate. And which is why when this project came up multiple times, it has been shelved, but now it's coming up again, and it was passed in some wildlife board, but has been stayed by the court. So I think those are some policy points within these processes that could be used in our favor. The public hearing is also a really nice venue, when done well, for local communities to voice social concerns, and project proponents have to account for them, again, ideally speaking. But in terms of practice, like Srini said, there are so many loopholes. So large projects are being split up into tiny bits and pieces to avoid having to go through this entire processes. Similarly, projects that are multi-purpose water infrastructure projects, like the Yethinhole diversion project, get branded as a drinking water project, which allows them to evade the entire EIA scrutiny. So they can go ahead and build 8 dams and hundreds of kilometers of diversion canals, pump water out of one river and take it hundreds of kilometers away inland, all without any EIA requirement or biodiversity assessment, which is, so yeah, it's kind of a sad picture, but it's true that the loopholes are much larger than what we can really use.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe one other untapped tool would be the CAMPA funds. So every time forests have been diverted for development, project proponents are asked to deposit money towards compensatory activities. So in principle, again, a lot of us do not agree with this, because cutting old growth forests and then planting some saplings on a road divide, for example, are not really compensating. You're not compensating for anything. But it has amassed a huge amount of money, which could be used to purchase land, reconnect corridors. It could be used for really good stuff. But again, currently, a lot of that money is being used for infrastructure development inside forests, like building guest houses or watchtowers or patrol roads, which again, it's sort of about having the political will to really want to do good conservation.
So these examples were those of projects being halted during the process of an EIA. But are there cases where projects were persecuted for their actions, at least after they were built or something like that?
Very few. There was a small dam, the Maruti Jain Power Project, again on the Yethinhole River. that was stopped mid-construction due to some discrepancy. I'm not aware of all the details. But we largely see projects getting away with complete impunity. So there are projects that begin construction that start felling forests without any clearance, and they get an ex post facto clearance, which magically makes it all okay. We've seen that small dams, often you have two different small dams being built together to form one large dam. And again, this is a clear, the intention is really clear. It's like these project proponents propose one small dam on the left bank of a river, another small dam on the right bank of the river. So they don't need any EIA clearances. They also get subsidies from the government and international agencies because they're green projects. And then they build from the left and right bank and join in the middle. And they have a common powerhouse. And in terms of their size and ecological footprint, they are like any other large dam. And these projects just get away scot-free. So
I think
not the best track record.
On the terrestrial front, I think the NH7 is a good case study. When they already had started implementing the project, the court had to step in because of pressure from civil society, and mitigation structures were asked to be built. Okay, without getting into the mess of doing it, yes. So during the course of the project, there has been one success story where something good has come out of it. Now, maybe MOAF and others might be putting pictures of animals under underpasses and selfies and things like that. But yeah, that came because people fought for it and made sure links were being restored and some mitigation structures were put in place. So I would say on the terrestrial front, that is a good example to look up to.
I think this is a really interesting question. Can we build flyovers over protected areas? Instead of roads, are flyovers better?
You can build for, I think, few kilometers. You can't build for 30, 40 kilometers. You cannot build a flyover. And again, there it depends on the kind of terrain. So this is whether you build an underpass, overpass. So these decisions are driven by the kind of terrain that you're dealing with. So you just can't build flyovers everywhere. And yeah, so you can build for short stretches, and there will be some impacts during the construction phase. Probably it will be minimized post construction. These flyovers could work, but again, there are costs of building it. And the first question is, why do you want to? Is that road really required within a national park or a wildlife sanctuary? So if you answer that, and if there is no other alternative that you can explore or implement, then you need to think of roads which are less damaging. And if there are alternatives, I would still think the alternative, even if it is a little more expensive, is a better option rather than going for a road with mitigation structures. So the first is try and do a realignment, and if there is a realignment possibility, even if the cost is a little more, I think it should be fine. Just taking if you look at the alternative route for Bandipur, and
yes,
so it is 30-40 kilometers longer. Now, especially in today's context, when you can literally zoom through these national highways where you can hit 100-120 kilometers. Just from a commuting perspective, I think that 30-40 kilometers of extra distance is not much. You're driving faster, you're driving safer, and most certainly your travel time will be much better than going at 30 kilometers per hour inside a forested zone. So that is just from a commuting perspective. So I think these kind of strong messages need to be sent out. Right now, it is said, oh, it will reduce the distance by 30 kilometers. Now, nobody tells you have to drive that 30 kilometers inside the forest at a speed limit of 20 or 30 kilometers per hour.
Yeah.
Whereas if you could drive those 30 kilometers outside at 100, 120, I am quite sure everybody will say, I'll take that other route. Even if it is 30 kilometers more, I'll save time.
Mhm.
I think
I
these
think
kind
we
of
have,
messages need to be sent out.
right. I think we have time for just one last question. And Suman, can you just quickly let us know of your opinion of the river linking project?
Oh, where do I start? So that's an absolute disaster, right? Uh, so the very premise of the entire project is you have these water surplus basins and water deficit basins, and there's no clear definition of what defines something to be water surplus and what defines something to be water deficit. So the delineation of these water surplus and deficit basins itself is, I think, completely unscientific and completely illogical. And then there's this whole thing of wanting to control the flow of water, which I think is
Yeah.
really, it's so arrogant. And there are so many problems associated with it, right from spreading of pollution, of invasive species, of diseases. How are you going to deal with these interstate and transboundary water conflicts that arise? You're going to take, there are also social justice issues. You know, if you have marginalized communities on one side and you have industries or commercial hubs on the other end receiving water, is it really fair to take water from these guys and send it there when they might not have the resources to really defend their needs and requirements? It's a whole Pandora's box, and there have been some river interlinking projects done in the south which have gone really bad, one especially in Andhra. And a lot of scientists are using that as a case study to tell the government that this is not going to be as straightforward and easy. There are lots of international scientists who have modeled and looked at how it's going to affect fish species and have found the results to be disastrous. But again, there seems to be some nexus between politicians and these contractors and engineers and bureaucrats. Yeah. So we might say that we are doing this for the benefit of people, but one really needs to look at these projects more critically and question who's really going to benefit and who has to bear the costs.
Yeah.
Just adding to what Suman said about water surplus and deficit. So if you ask people, go out and ask people about linking of rivers project, they all seem to think water will flow both ways. So which is not truth. It is like flowing from an upstream to a downstream. There is no way, if there is a shortage upstream, the downstream river is going to give you back water. So general perception is in some way, once you link it, there will be water in both places. So if one is short, the other one will supply. So that is not the case. So general perceptions are also important here, because these projects do get a lot of traction when it comes to water. So people who want to irrigate, cultivate, they might support these projects. The minute they are told it's not what you think, there's only a flow of water one way, it's like a one-way road, then probably they will also think of supporting these interlinking
And just
projects.
adding to that, like even in peninsular India, right, we have a lot of these west flowing rivers. So they originate on the Western Ghats and they're flowing for just a short distance, 100, 150 kilometers, till they empty out into the sea. And there's this whole belief that when these rivers are flowing into the sea, it's a waste of precious freshwater resources that could be sent to the parched inlands. And this messaging, like Srini said, it's the messaging of it that's really misleading. Because you tell people, oh, the water's going waste, we can just divert it. We have engineers and we'll solve all these water scarcity problems. And no one's really looking at, you're going to divert all this fresh flowing water inland, which means if you don't have the fresh water flowing out, you're going to have salt water coming in. There's going to be increased salinization of coastal areas. Your groundwater reserves are going to get more saline. It's going to affect agriculture there. Also, even in the case of Yattanhole, right? They were like, we are going to divert the Yattanhole waters to Kolar. But the year the project, or the year after the project was started, Bantwal was hit with a major drought. So the basin from which you're taking water is also getting hit by drought. The studies that look at the water demand for that basin are not projecting for future growth. So they're not looking into the future. They're looking at today's water demand given today's population. But what about 10 years, 20 years in the future? You're building these projects not for just today. It's going to last for a good 50, 60 years. And then it's just really unplanned. Sometimes it just boggles my mind as to how badly these projects are thought of and assessed before thousands of crores are just invested in them.
Mm-hmm.
Just adding to that point, it's just not you removing water. So what you're also doing is you're cutting off sediments like your sand.
Yes.
Yes.
So the minute you stop the sand from flowing into the sea, what is going to happen is you're going to lose all your nice beaches. You're going to lose tourism. There's a whole lot of stuff that can happen. So as long as the message is clearly packaged and delivered, I think you will get a whole lot of traction where people will say, yes, we need to rethink if these projects are really useful or they're doing more harm than what it is proposed.
And also on the receiving end, so now in the Yattanhole case, for example, they're like, it's the poor communities in Kolar and Chikbalapur who will receive this water. But coincidentally, this project came up after 7 industrial parks were commissioned in that belt, where land is cheap and industries want to set up, and the only limiting thing for them is water. So I think we really need to look at things critically. Who's really going to benefit from these really expensive infrastructure projects? Is it really going to go to those communities who need it? Or is it going to serve another purpose?
Right. Yeah. In the interest of time, we would like to end our discussion here, although the questions do not stop. Srinivas and Suman, it's been a great pleasure talking to you both. Thank you for a wonderful session this evening. So for those who would like to catch up on this webinar, today's session will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel, along with our previous webinars as well. Thank you, everyone. It's been a great evening. See you in the next session.
Thank you, Kritika.
Thank you. Thank you, Kritika and CWS. If you can email the questions, I think with a delayed response, Suman and I can email it back to you. You can share it with the participants.
Yes, we will make sure to share the questions. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Have a nice